thank you very much for coming out in this awful weather and down here.
It's down a little bit, but probably not too much, so we can still see you, right?
Okay, thank you very much. Let me talk a little bit about the Habitats column, which doesn't exist anymore. And as part of my Times career, everything I seem to be involved with dies. Not because of me, I trust. The city section is no more, and the Habitats column is no more. But I think the real estate section, which is what I work for now, will be around forever, as this exhibition suggests, because people will always want lovely, expensive buildings, which is our main purview. When the city section was closed in 2009 due to budget issues and replaced by a different and lovely section, Metropolitan, they needed to find something for me to do and amortize my amazingly large time salary. So I was put in the real estate section and given a column that had been around since the early 90s called Habitats. And it was always a little slice of life as to how somebody lived somewhere in the metropolitan area. And that was the only thing it really needed to be. And it needed to be someone who would tell you their real names and sit for a picture and tell you how much they paid to live where they live. And be living there legally. And when I got the column, I thought this was great and kind of had my name on it because didn't have too much to do with housing economics, which I find very daunting, but it did have to do with storytelling. And so I decided that what I wanted to do, also because I hate to drive and I don't have a car, so I didn't want to have it focus on the New York metropolitan area, which it had previously, but also for reasons of authenticity in a way. I wanted to focus on people who lived in the 5 boroughs of New York City, and I hope that way that when you put all the columns together would really give you a multifaceted profile of the city and how people live there. I also wanted, and this was also different from some of my predecessors who focused more on high-end homes and also more on matters of decor and design and what you do with the floor and what you do with the ceilings. I wanted to write about a diverse crowd of New Yorkers, rich, poor, black, white, different ethnicity, different family structure, different ages, different jobs. And so that when you put it all together, you really had a kind of a mosaic of the city, sort of the, whatever your political preference, sort of the Bill de Blasio New York, that wasn't just people with a ton of money living in very expensive places. And I did get to write about some luxurious homes and some mansions and some classic 8s or classic 50s practically on Park Avenue. But what I really loved most is the stories that took me into worlds that I wasn't familiar with, parts of the city I wasn't familiar with, and especially that had a kind of a strong narrative that could have been, for all you writers in the audience, that almost could have been a short story, except it was true. And in a way, all my columns were my favorite. It's like All Your Children, and certainly all the ones in the book were my favorite. But in a way, the one that was really closest to my heart, and I don't say that just because Boris is sitting here 2 feet away, but was the story about him, and partly because it was the first column I wrote, and I really wanted to make it very, very Sacco and very special, but partly because the story was so moving. It wasn't just someone who had a place to live and this is what they did with it. But if you buy the book and if you read it, and as Boris himself will tell you, the narrative and the real story was not just what happened to the apartment, but had to do with being an immigrant, with relationships between parents and children, with respect to parents but carving your own way, and how this played out in a very concrete way. Colors and materials and furnishings. It wasn't just abstract discussion. And I don't know if I was able to do it justice in the column, but what I hoped is that that by the end of reading it, they weren't even that long, although they're longer in the book than they were in the paper because there's more room in a book. That you had an understanding of some of these issues and some of the conflicts and some of the strains and some of the rewards. It wasn't just about someone lives in a nice place. Another thing that was very, and was helped that Boris was so articulate about this too, and didn't just say, well, I painted the walls red, end of conversation. The other thing that I found very moving about Boris's story is that he lives in, as you'll see in their pictures, he lives in one of the old co-ops on the Lower East Side, where there were, many of which were built for workers, were built by unions, and they've changed hands quite a bit over the years. But when you're in their presence, you really feel like you're in the presence of an earlier New York. And one of the things I remembered when I was rereading the column prior to tonight, and a tiny little detail, but it really kind of tugs at your heart. The emblem for your building is, don't laugh, it's two little pine trees holding hands, and it's I don't know if that's the one for Co-op City. I think it may indeed be, but it's for a number of the high-rise co-ops that were built in sort of early and mid-century New York City, and that had controlled costs and had a political and an ideological underpinning, which is very different from what you see today, as all these pictures remind us. But when I came to interview Boris, and I remember the day, I remember the weather, and kind of walking around to get a feel of the neighbor in the Lower East Side, which I didn't know as well as I should. But I remember standing in front of these little, embracing pine trees and being very, very moved by the image, because they did tell you about an earlier sitting. When I was doing when I was putting the columns together in a book, one of the things I wanted to tease out from the stories, and it's something I discuss in the introduction to the book, is what makes a home in New York different from a home someplace else? Why is it different to live in New York than it is Chicago or Philadelphia or Boston or Washington or a little city, Albany or Cincinnati or the Berkshires or Westchester County or, the suburbs or the exurbs? What is it that's distinctive about life in New York? And I thought this would be, to be able to discuss this would tie all the columns together. And I thought, well, this will be very easy to write. I'll just, Google what makes a home in New York distinctive, and there'll be a ton of things, and I can crib from them, and that'll take about 2 days, and I'll be done. Well, it was sort of sadly, and yet not sadly, not so easy. And I read a lot of, there aren't even that many, interestingly, classic essays about New York, like, E.B. White and F. Scott Fitzgerald and Nora Ephron and, the usual suspects, Joan Didion, of course. And they were all very moving, but they didn't help me tease out the things that made a New Yorker's life and home distinctive, but they pointed me in some directions. And one of the most important, of course, again, it kind of relates to the exhibition, the Skyscraper Museum's mission, has to do with the issue of living in a city defined by density and verticality, which basically means high apartment buildings. Something that E.B. White said in his wonderful essay, Here is New York, which I recommend rereading to anyone here who has not reread it recently. It really brings tears to your eyes, and it's a little mushy, I have to say, but it's very, very moving. But one of the things he says in this essay is that New York gives you the gift of loneliness and the gift of privacy. and you wonder, these are good or maybe these are not so good. But they're certainly related to a city that's defined by density and verticality, which is high-rise apartment buildings, which so many people live in. And the fact that these apartments are small, the fact that your neighbors are close by, the fact you have views. The view is the best thing you can have in New York. Recently, either people have them and they brag about them, or they don't have them and maybe they have something else like a fireplace. And also because of the crunched up housing, for New Yorkers, the world outside of their apartment is very, very significant. The park, the stoop, even the little vest pocket park. I live in Brooklyn Heights, so I have the Brooklyn Heights Promenade, and it's wonderful, and it'd probably be wonderful anywhere. But it's certainly more wonderful if you're living, packed like sardines in an apartment house. A couple of other things I learned that define New York housing. One is that by comparison to a lot of other places, it's very, very old. I mean, you again look at these buildings, you think everything was put up yesterday practically, but according even to the statistics in the book, which are now a few years old, 85% of residential buildings in New York were built before 1970, and 39% before 1930, which is a long time ago, and 17% before 1920, so almost 100 years old. And what the effect of that is it makes us feel very much as if we're living in a city of the past, despite all the newness, that we're on the palimpsest and of layers below where we are, and the huge amount of nostalgia that I think New Yorkers feel. Even people who have come very recently or are very, very young often say to me, I remember what it was like. I miss the way it was like. And they're 22 and they arrived 6 weeks ago. They didn't even know what it was like. But there's something about the age and the patina of age, despite all the new construction, that I think makes people feel this. And a final aspect of the city, and then we can talk about Boris's apartment, is that it's so storied in culture, in every Woody Allen movie, every Edith Wharton novel, Gershwin, Hopper, the Water Towers, Law and Order, rap music, you name it. New York is a character and is a very vivid character. And I think that helps people think and feel and believe that they live in a place that has great importance and great significance. I think maybe Paris gives you the same feeling, maybe London, though maybe not even London now, maybe Rome, maybe San Francisco a little bit, but few places as much as New York. And it can be such a difficult city. And again, in terms of these buildings, finding housing you can afford, finding housing if you're young. I think New Yorkers worry about homelessness more than anyone else in the world, because you think you're hanging on by your fingernails, and you kind of are. But you cope with the difficulties because you do feel that the payoffs are very great, and I think it's being balanced on this knife edge that very much defines how New Yorkers feel about their city. When I've had done events regarding the book and had guests who were kind enough to come and talk a little bit about what the experience was like sort of being the subject and how that made them think about where they live, and just, nice to see them again. One of the things that sometimes has come up, to my great dismay, is they mention all the things they didn't tell me at the time, and all the really good stories. And sometimes they very consciously, well, I didn't tell you about the roommate who killed the other roommate because, that was private. So I almost, wish I could redo them with all the new information. But the other thing that's nice for me, and it's nice to share with an audience, is so much of journalism, you're kind of in, you're out. You're kind of like a SWAT team. You come, you sort of bond with the people, you talk, you feel you're close, you never see them again. And in a way, you want to know how the story ends and how are they doing, and just it was always a pleasurable experience. So it's nice to be able to repeat it. But as I said, with the story of Boris's apartment, it was such a rich story in so many ways. That you always want to know what's come after, and he can talk about that. And we have some pictures, so you'll be able to see what it looks like. But it certainly is, although it did not involve huge amounts of money, I think that's fair to say, because he did a lot of the work himself. But that it certainly was one of the more gorgeous apartments I looked at. There were some apartments, not that these were not lovely people, but I'd come into the apartment and my heart would sink because they looked awful, and I thought, the photo editor is going to kill me if, when she sees what it's like. But this was an example of you just wanted to kind of, sit there and stay and say, all right, I'll be your new roommate and I'll admire your decor. But anyhow, so this is Boris of the wonderful apartment, and tell them your story.
My story? Okay. Well, the day that they came to photograph it was a day much like today, when there was no sun outside the windows. But it came out okay. Where should I begin? I'm Sky High, the cut rate version. Yeah. I live on the 15th floor of a high-rise on the very eastern end of the Lower East Side, the not fashionable part of the Lower East Side. If you know Grand Street, it's 4 south of Houston, and if you go all the way toward the river, my building is far enough from the river that it doesn't flood when a hurricane hits, but close enough to the river that East River Park is right there. It's the best of both worlds. And it's a very different neighborhood than the Lower East Side, as you know it. And in fact, one of the ways in which it's different is that commerce does not survive there. We have one dry cleaners, one sort of Chinese place, one bodega, and that's it. We've had coffee shops and restaurants, but they just don't make it. There aren't enough people. That's the downside, in a sense. The upside is everybody knows everybody. And if you walk into a place, you're recognized, and it's a lovely thing that doesn't happen in many places in New York. And it does have all this history because, as Connie mentioned, it was built in these high-rises were built in 1955. They were low-income housing for garment workers. They were privatized in the 90s. And as you can see in some of the pictures, partly for cost reasons and partly for aesthetic reasons, I kept a lot of the original features. In the kitchen, when it comes up, you'll see that was built in 1950. That porcelain top for the sink, for example, those cabinets, that's all 1955. When I moved into the apartment, the person who had been living there since 1955. She had passed away in the apartment. Her dentures were still in the bathroom cabinet. And I maintained a kind of supernatural relationship with her to this day. It looked nothing like that. But it only took, I wish I brought, for a birthday, a friend of mine who helped me move in. He took photographs when we did, and for a birthday he gave me a before and after book of photographs. I wish I'd brought the before book. It was, imagine in the bathroom, pink tile, black wallpaper, these sliding shower doors with frosted mermaids, which I should have kept. Yeah. That's you learn. To bring it, to make it look like that, cost $15,000. So it isn't a merely cosmetic renovation, but in some ways it is. Partly because I couldn't afford it, and partly because I wanted to keep it the way it was. Because in a weird way, some of the features as they used to be kind of worked with the design I wanted to give it. There's something about 1955 New York that works with a Mexican hacienda. I'm not sure. I don't know why, but you discover in the process. Because actually, and I'll tell you in a second why it has these Mexican overtones, but very little in the apartment is actually from Mexico. Much as in fiction, which is what I do, I write fiction, you can't really go at things head on. Novels, as you know, are a little bit more elusive than, say, nonfiction is. In the same way, if you want to create the feeling of a Mexican hacienda in your 15th floor apartment in a concrete high-rise in Lower East Side, you actually can't have anything from Mexico. So there are things from India, from Afghanistan, from Romania, from Guatemala, some from Mexico, some from Russia, which is where I'm from. But very little actually from Mexico. And it's almost like you have to go at it from the side in order to, because otherwise it looks kitschy. If I have nothing but stamped tin mirrors and sombreros, it's a different vibe. Why Mexico is because, and I'll tell the story very quickly, and then I'll turn it back to you. You'll ask me something. But I was born in the former Soviet Union. I was 9 years old when we came to the States. We settled in New York like everyone does. And by the way, do you know why there are so many Russians in the tri-state area? It's because it was free to settle in New York. If you wanted to emigrate to San Francisco or Chicago, there was some sort of fee that you had to pay for the opportunity to move there. And it was nominal, it was like $500, but if you don't have any money, it's a lot. So the immigrants went where the entry was free, and so we moved to New York. We lived in Bensonhurst for 5 years in southern Brooklyn. My father desperately wanted to leave the Soviet Union because he hated the Soviet part, and he said, I didn't leave the Soviet Union to end up among a bunch of Russians in Bensonhurst. So he moved us out to New Jersey, which was horrible in its own way. Now I'm a defender of New Jersey. In fact, a book that I'm going to write down the line is called New Jersey in Defense of a Maligned State, because it is a beautiful place in many ways, but not where my parents decided to settle.
Where was that? So
it's and I hope there's no one from there here. Finally, my mom didn't come to an event. It's a town called Wayne. It's in northern New Jersey. The town is like this, so half of it always floods when the rains come in the fall. And so as you can imagine, real estate here costs very little, and here it costs a lot. But it doesn't even have a downtown. It's just strip malls. It is a semi-affluent town, but it doesn't have a lot of character. So I fled as soon as I could, which is to say after college. And the first place I settled in New York was the Upper East Side. And the reason that I settled on the Upper East Side is because that was my parents' dream for me. They brought me to America so that I could make it with the rich folks, And can you imagine a 24-year-old could manage to afford a place with what he had saved, and they helped me as well because there's no question of renting in an immigrant family. None whatsoever. I'd saved some money by this point, they helped as well, and I was able to purchase a small studio on the Upper East Side. And so the immigrant narrative, the American dream, was on full force. The problem is that I was miserable. And no offense against anyone who lives on the Upper East Side, but it's not a neighborhood for 24-year-olds. At least not for this 24-year-old. I felt like I was among people who were older, who had slightly more conventional interests. But when you're 24, you barely understand yourself. Whom you admire, telling you that this is the right thing to do. So it takes a while to understand what the right answer for yourself is. And eventually, as with so many things in life, it was decided for me when my next door neighbor and his wife got pregnant again and decided that they needed to expand and didn't want to move. And so they wanted to break through my wall and take over my place. And I was all too thrilled, A, to no longer live next to them, and B, to give them my place. So, and this was 2005. It was at the height of the bubble. The bubble was already inflated by then. So with that money, so if you look where I'm living now, you can get a place for twice the size at half the cost, which is what I managed. It's how I managed to go from a studio to a one-bedroom. I mean, where I live now, it's a 10-minute walk from the subway, which to a non-New Yorker is really unremarkable. To a New Yorker, it's unconscionable, you know? But because it's so out of the way, because even the Second Avenue subway won't go anywhere near where I live, truly, it's like the unrecognized territory, you know? It is unadmitted by the city. They've tried to coin all kinds of names for it, because, you know, the way you make it is you coin a name. And so they've tried Belldel. Can anyone guess what Belldel stands for? Below Delancey. Loho, lower than Houston. Nothing's really kept. And that is how I ended up there. And there's more to the story, but we'll leave it for later.
Broom Street?
No. I have the distinction of living on a street no one's ever heard of. It's called Lewis Street. Well, it's Grand and Lewis. The building is sort of catty corner, Grand and Lewis. But Broome is one over. I see Broome out of my window. Good parking spots on Broome.
One of the things I remember, and I think these pictures give you a sense of it, these golden walls and the mirrors and the deep red walls, is, you know, seeing the beautiful tiles and the backsplash. And every room was a different color. And you told me that many of them got repainted again and again to get it right, because it looks very easy when you see it. But I remember visiting you, and it was a late sort of spring afternoon, late spring afternoon. You see, look at these great colors. And coming in, you'd been recommended to me by a mutual friend who used to write for me for the city section, and he said, I know a guy who has a hacienda sort of in the sky, which was, that wasn't the headline in the Times, but I think it's what we used for the book because there's such a lovely phrase. But I remember walking into this, you know, kind of drab building on this golden late afternoon, and walking into this saturated with color environment, and everything was glowing, and everything had a story, and a lot of it was inspired, I don't know if you've seen the pictures, but by visits to Mexico. And I couldn't quite understand why someone who'd grown up with all that snow had gone to Mexico so much, so I had to wrap my mind around that idea. But I remember how gorgeous everything looked. And then I guess after we talked and you showed me around, we were looking at a window, and you could look out. I mean, talk about high-rise, even though you're just 15 stories. Looked out, and your building was exactly where you could see the, was it the Manhattan Bridge traffic?
You can see two bridges.
You could see two bridges, Williamsburg and Manhattan. And it's this, you know, quintessential, you know, New York 40s movies, the lights in a dark sky, the little flecks of light, and it's so moving and so urban and so lovely, and you feel you could look at it all the time. And you're again in this setting with these adorable little details that somehow were not kitschy. I still don't know how you managed to do it. And these very deeply colored walls, and it really felt both very well like a stage set, but also a place where you could live, and you showed me where you wrote. And I'm remembering in connection with something else that the way I discovered your work is at some point with the city section, we did a special issue on young immigrants, and we had 10 or 15 people who could write, who were immigrants and under 30, write an essay about themselves and their experience. And you wrote about yourself, and that's how I knew you for starters. But of course, all the books. What I found fascinating is that, I mean, you had a ton of books, but I subsequently saw a lot of apartments of very bright, well-educated people, and they had no books. And I still am having trouble wrapping my mind around that. And my daughter says it's generational, that their books are home with their parents. I don't know if that's true. But everybody over 50 had tons of books, and the older they were, the more books they had, you know, the oven, the bathtub practically. But it was very nice to see someone under, you know, 30 or 35 who had a lot of books. That was very, very inspiring. But it was very moving to be in the apartment, and partly because it just made such a vivid aesthetic impression on you. And it really was kind of the glamour of New York high-rise living, even though it wasn't per se a glamorous building or a glamorous neighborhood, but somehow that view gave it a lot of glamour.
Yeah, it's on the 15th floor. And so you're staring at the crowns of buildings most of the day. The clouds are at eye level. The Freedom Tower is right there. So it's very striking. And I often wonder, because there was an identical apartment on the second floor for considerably less money when I purchased this one. And you know, it's the same wing of the building, so sort of same layout. And I think it was on my father's advice that I went with the higher floor one, on the idea that higher floors are better for some reason that isn't often articulated, but is held to be, you know, fact. And I'm so grateful that happened, because I really do feel like I work from home. I mean, I write, so it's also my office. And even though the colors are allowed, and the first thing that, for example, my mother said to me when I told her about my plan for it, she said, it's all going to press down on you and make you feel very attacked. For some reason it has the opposite. The ceilings are not enormous, but for some reason it has the opposite effect. And to this day, 8+ years later, it has a very calming effect. I was on a trip this weekend, and I just walked into it for the first time this afternoon after being away for a week before coming here. And there's a palpable feeling of that happens when you walk in. And I can't even say why. It's just a kind of a little bit of grace. As Connie mentioned, your first time out of the gate is not always so successful, because when you have the idea to make something bright and Mexican, it doesn't really come to life full formed. The first variation of all these colors was just that garish tinge off, you know? It was a kind of circus red and a circus orange and a circus blue. So it all had to get redone. But where it ended up very sort of tranquil and serene. And for me, it's like an oasis. I love it there. And I don't know if this is true for anyone here, but speaking to something that Connie said before, you know, with one foot, I have been trying to leave New York as soon as I moved here. It just sort of, I think, part of the reason it's so valuable to many of the people who live here is because it's so damn hard to live here. And my response to that, in part, has been to fantasize about other places to live. But a major reason why I haven't done that is that place. I mean, I'm still there 8 years later. So.
One of the things that we can maybe have some questions. One of the things I've discovered now that the book's been out and the column is gone is sort of what came next and what happened to people. And in a few cases, people have died, and in a few cases, couples have separated, and in a few cases also, people have moved. And this all makes me feel very sad, because I know no one has any obligation to keep something the way it is just because I wrote about it. And I know these things they didn't necessarily have control over. And sometimes they tell me very apologetically, you know, say, I know you loved our house. I'm sorry to tell you that we're not there anymore, but, you know, we loved it too, but we had to move because, etc. So I think they know I'm going to be upset. But it's very, very gratifying to me when what's in the book is still in real life. And you kind of feel the story goes on and the good parts of it go on, and the things that made them attached to the space. The first, you know, when I came into contact with them, that they're still unspooling, they're still playing themselves out, and that's very nice for me. I mean, you maybe won't be there for your entire life, but I'm glad you're still there now.
There's an interesting reason why it has remained largely the way. A lot of work went into it. For 6 months I was working on it, but once it has remained largely the same. And the reason for that is sort of the last piece of the story, which I haven't discussed yet, which is the place that I had on the Upper East Side. If anyone is familiar with the immigrant story and living in New York, I feel like everyone is. It's sort of death by love. So when I moved into my place on the Upper East Side, I was very busy trying to build a career for myself as a journalist. And my parents volunteered to help me with the place, setting up the place, because the way that we were able to afford it is it wasn't in very good shape and it needed some work. My father, his official posting is he's a doorman in a fancy building on the Upper East Side. But his great gift is he has hands of gold. He's an amazing craftsman. He can paint, he can varnish, he can saw, he can build this thing. He can build this floor. He can build, a chandelier. He can do it all. And he said, "Boris, you're doing valuable stuff. Let us help you." And I was reluctant because I felt like this is something that you should do for yourself. But it was an offer I couldn't pass up. But what ended up happening was that, with the best of intentions, they created a place that looked like a place they wanted to live, rather than a place. Now, but listen, you're in a bind because, may a 24-year-old have a problem like parents who want to give so much that, The problem is this 24-year-old had deep, ideas and feelings about his living environment because. There are people among us who don't care about that much about the place where they live, and then there are other people who do. Why that is a private question, but I was one of the latter, and I never felt at home there, and it really bothered me. And I think partly it has to do with the fact that when I was 9 years old, I was taken out of the only country that I'd known to be home, and settled in a new place that was not exactly easy and familiar in every way, and then on top of it, I had to live in a place that didn't really feel like home. Well, on the one hand, it sounds like spoiled complaining. On the other, there's nothing worse than feeling twice removed from a sense of home. So when the sports physician, or is that the professional sports?
Yeah.
The sports doctor next door, and his wife got pregnant, and I had the opportunity to move. In addition to finding a place that was in a neighborhood that frightened my parents, for example, because it was so ethnic, because it was full of immigrants. My neighborhood is Black, Orthodox Jewish, Dominican, Chinese, and me. Wherever I fit in that spectrum, and it's not an upper class neighborhood. It's not a lower class neighborhood. It's sort of both at once. Chinatown really keeps things real, if you know what I'm saying. But one of the things that was really important to me, because once again, you walk into an apartment, it looks frightening, but it's also an opportunity. I've actually concluded that you never ever want to move into a place that has already been designed for you, because you really have little to contribute, unless you're strictly looking for that kind of convenience. And I decided that it was really important for me to try to make something of it that was purely my own. Now, at the time, I had been dating seriously a woman for maybe 2 years by that point, and we had been starting to talk about moving in together, and this was a perfect opportunity to do that. And I sort of, and the location was chosen partly with her contribution, and so I went to her and I said, "What do you think we should do with this place?" And to her everlasting credit, she said, "I think you should do this thing entirely by yourself." And I think what I think has nothing to do with it, because for several years you've sort of been living in an environment that you did not create for yourself, and it happens to be really important for you to live in a place that reflects aspects of you. And I don't want you to have to go from one living experience where you're sort of doing it in tandem with somebody else aesthetically to another where you're again with the best of intentions, but now compromising with me. And it was only, and I argued against her, but it turned out to be an incredibly wise piece of advice that allowed me to explore in this way. And I just let it rip. Right around that time, I was falling in love with Mexico because it is warm, because it's beautiful, because they have a really wonderful relationship to the arts, to family, to community. It's hard to generalize about Mexico because it's a very big country, very different in different places, but the places that I've been visiting in the center and the south, which is, by the way, where a lot of the Mexican workers who live and work in New York, they mainly come from the south. Puebla, Chiapas, Oaxaca, those kinds of places, rather than the north, which often has a very different culture. And partly from being there and partly from being here, I fell in love with that culture. And was there a reason why I couldn't make my 15th floor apartment in a high-rise in New York look like a Mexican hacienda? That was the freedom of it. There was not. And so that's what I did. But the thing is that I really, partly through the gifts of people who loved me, partly through circumstance and through luck, I had the opportunity to do my own thing without consulting anyone, and I really got it out of my system. And after I finished those 6 months of very intense labor, where like you would find me at 3 a.m. in a notebook comparing swatches and tile patterns and costs and, you know, and then it was over. And since July 2006, when I finished working on it, I have done almost nothing to it. I'm finished. And if and when I ever move to another place, I'm not sure that I will apply the same amount of forethought and design to its decor. It was an incredibly important personal experience that I was very fortunate to have captured and highlighted by Connie, because I think these things happen 1,000 times a day in the city every day. You know, I just had the fortune to have mine sort of chronicled by Connie. And you know, to take a step back, to sort of discover your identity through the decor of your apartment is really like a first world problem. You know, and I recognize that. But I was brought to the first world from whatever world I was birthed in, and I had that amazing opportunity. It's one of the things that is very cool about living in New York, is you actually have the opportunity to have this experience. And so, you know, I feel a little bit bashful about that privilege, but I also feel fortunate and grateful because it was awesome. So.
And the final thing I should say, and then maybe we can have a few questions, is one of the things I think this story dramatizes very vividly and was true for all the habitats people I wrote about, probably true for everybody, is the very powerful and kind of mystical and sometimes very hard to put into words connection people feel to the place where they live. And even if, I mean, this was gorgeous, but sometimes even if it's horrible and has many obvious limitations, the deep sense of connection that people have to their home, and it can be very different sorts of homes. I mean, many that I saw, I thought, oh my God, I'm glad I don't live there, and others I felt, you know, like this, you know, well, just let me move in and sit on your sofa forever. But the connection, the very mystical connection between who you are and where you live and your feelings about it that I think are hard to put into words, but mean a great deal. And if there's a disconnect, I think you know it, and you try to be in a setting where there's not a disconnect. Are there any questions?
By the way, I just want to say one more thing, which is that there was an odd moment where I thought quite fondly of the Upper East Side. Yeah. And I was like, things are too crazy downtown. Yeah. I might be ready when the time comes for my next wife, then I'll be ready to go back uptown. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Did someone have a question?
Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Where's your desk? Is it a writer's desk full of papers or what?
It's right there.
Right there.
Good timing.
Yeah.
And actually, that comes from Housing Works. And it was the very first thing I acquired for the house. And as a sign of my novice-dom, I didn't bother to measure it. I just liked it and said, let's get it. And it turned out to be too big for the door. There are all sorts of like semi-humiliating things that you learn about yourself when you're trying to do this. And so, but miraculously, if you took down the door, the desk did fit. And it set the tone. It's an amazing desk. I do have another desk in the bedroom that I don't think is among these images, that was built by my father. And it's a beautiful desk. I've tried so hard to get him to give up the safe route and make furniture. And he has absolutely no interest in an entrepreneurial career path. but he is just incredibly gifted, and so. But I never write at that desk. That desk is for the printer or something. I always write at the desk in the living room because it's big, it's cuffed, it's got wood, it's got iron, it's got a deep sense of use. I never varnish it. It's scratched up and cuffed, like I said, and I sort of like that sense of. We all patronize restaurants where the distress and the decor comes not from history, but from artificial contribution. And I don't know about you, but personally for me, that subtracts from the experience. I feel like if you haven't been distressed by experience and age and history, then just be new. It's okay. There's nothing wrong with being new. Like, it's beautiful too. Just be yourself. Again, if the desk started to look truly impoverished, I probably would varnish it. But I like the way it looks. It feels nice. It sort of helps.
But it doesn't look like a writer's desk for any of the writers I know. They're all full of papers and all that kind of thing.
I'm super neat. Super neat. Yeah, that's my mom. Yeah, that's my mom's contribution. That's her artificial contribution to my personality. Yeah. No, I guess that way sometimes, but not often. I like it neat. Yeah. Yeah.
Are there any, yes?
Connie, did you have any subjects who, as Boris mentioned, who didn't really care about where they lived? I mean, we all know people like that who just don't care what their home is like.
Yeah.
Did you, I assume naturally anybody whose home you're going to care quite a bit about where they live. Did you meet people who were rather different to their...
I didn't. That's interesting, and I didn't. I think if people weren't happy with where they were living, they wouldn't have had me come, because I think it would have been awkward, But people were happy and felt a sense of connection. And I couldn't imagine, to be honest, why some of them were happy, because I thought it was awful where they were. Not necessarily the place, but I remember, they're not in the book, but one couple I interviewed, they were lovely people. And, I felt like they were in Cleveland or something. They were so far away. They were somewhere, I guess, in the Rockaways. I remember, you travel for hours and you wouldn't be there, and it's of course always raining. And they both worked in the city, and I don't know if they had a new baby, they had something. And, so they had long commutes, and it wasn't like, oh, it's pretty. It was just like, you think they spend 5 hours in a bus every day. And I thought, and it was just like a little tract house. And I thought, what part of this do you like? They loved it. They were very proud. They had looked a long time. They were delighted to be by the sea and by these unattractive high-rises. They loved it all. I visited some people in apartments in public housing where, lovely people, but just incredibly cluttered. Not quite hoarders exactly, but, tons of stuff. And I thought, just how do you kind of move from one room to another? I saw places with, I guess you shouldn't admit this, but with what seemed to be just like terrible art. I just thought it would kind of give you nightmares. Be so garish. People have different tastes, but everyone seemed happy. They seemed proud. They would tell you kind of the origin story about how they got it and how they found it. I found people in apartments the size of this table practically. Some of them were gorgeous. They had done amazing things, but they were really, really small. I went to apartments that were many, many story walk-ups, and people would do that multiple times a day. Neighborhoods that were not not really of the best. I mean, one chapter in the book, I mean, it was a great story and the people were terrific, but they, a bunch of kids in their 20s, they lived in an old beer brewer's mansion in Bushwick, and it was, it was kind of interesting, and it was cheap, and it had once been a great building, and it suited their needs. But it was, and this was a few years ago, Bushwick was, despite its, hipster patina, it's there'd been like a murder a block away the day before, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought, I'm glad I'm not their mother. And so, there were a lot of, dicey neighborhoods. But it's fascinating. I don't even know the reason for this, but somehow, maybe if they weren't happy, they would have moved, although it's hard to move in New York. So I don't know if you like you grow to love an ugly pet and you become, do you think it's cute? I don't know. It's an interesting psychological question.
Yeah. You can look at it as a wonderful kind of liberation, because in my case, it was almost a compulsion to be so concerned about sort of what your four walls look like. I think partly because in the Soviet Union, so much of your private life took place indoors. There was really nowhere to go in the evening, and you were either in your living room or kitchen or somebody else's. And so for the most formative years of my life, I sort of imbibed the idea that all the valuable things between people happened indoors rather than outdoors. It was also really cold for 9 months out of the year, so it really, it would have been super helpful to me if I did not really care what my apartment looked like from 2003 to 2005 on the Upper East Side, because I was trying to get my career off the ground. The last thing I needed was to spend my time worrying about interior decoration, And now that I've gotten free of it in a way by having had this experience, I can see it from the other side, and it can feel like wonderful liberation from
not to have to.
Yeah.
So, someone had a question back.
Yeah, it's sort of a follow-up question, I guess. Do you discern any difference between people who are renting and who own the place? I say it's from so I moved recently from San Francisco, and renters there live a really long time in places they have rent control.
Yeah.
So my sense is that people move quite a bit more just because, if you're not...
Yeah, I know exactly what you're saying, and it's something they talk about in the real estate section where I work a lot, is are people who own happier? But I did interview a lot of renters because, again, I wasn't going for the high end, but I mean, it's interesting you asked the question because I never gave it a thought, and I think that in New York, renting is so different than it is anywhere else, and so so much the default. And when I was growing up in New York, I mean, it was a long time before I knew anyone who owned something, and they would be some decrepit brownstone somewhere that bought for $27,000. But you rented, and everybody rented. People's parents rented, and I think that it's because it's so common in the city, and you're rent controlled, you're rent stabilized, you're not rent stabilized, you're something that it wasn't, and people did so much to their apartments. I mean, you'd open the door and there'd be these incredible worlds. I mean, especially as you're writing about a more ethnically mixed city, it's like. You open the door and you're in Honduras, and you open the door and you're in Denmark, and you open the door you're in Kenya. You name it, it's there, and that seemed to be regardless of whether people owned or rented the stamp they put on their space.
A different kind of historical question, I guess, based on what you just said, because when you say you open the door and you're in some place, because all of the pieces are from 2009 to 2011.
12, I guess maybe.
What did you say about that moment in New York? How is this? Was there something you could see that was characteristic of time rather than
that city? Well, I think that, I mean, it's a very interesting question because I think it became a window on a much more multicultural city. I've been thinking about this a lot because I'm going to be teaching a course on immigration in New York in the spring, and so I've been reading a lot and looking at statistics and looking at numbers. And the current amazing statistic is 1 out of 3. That 1 out of 3 New Yorkers is an immigrant or a child of immigrants, and that the transformation of people are from since in the last 50, 40 years has been profound. I mean, sort of beyond description.
in 1900.
Yeah, and also, I mean, back then, you know, they came from Italy, they came from Ireland, they, you know, came from Germany, they came from Russia. I mean, came from a few little places, you know, a few people from Greece, but now, you know, the entire world, and the fact that people move back and forth so much, you know, it's. They didn't come from there to here. They came from there to here, and then they go back, or they're back and forth. They're shuttling. So there's much more, and they're not trying to Americanize as much as you know as was. So I hear all the languages and all the holidays. You know, there are like dozens of now no parking holidays. And one of the things I was struck by, I mean, I felt I was constantly being, you know, sent back to, you know, Wikipedia to, you know, learn more about Bangladesh, you know, learn more about, you know, Dominican Republic, you know, you name it, I would have to get a little crash course. But behind the doors, these so many unexpected worlds are hidden, and that. You know, that was certainly happening a great deal during the period that I was writing the columns, and of course continuing, you know, more so and more so now. I mean, another thing is the issue of economics of housing, because it was, you know, right when the recession was having its effect, and Bloomberg's luxury, and the two forces were fighting each other. So there was just so much discussion of the affordability of housing, and the two in the book, the two very, very tiny apartments that I wrote about. You know, 200 square, 300 square feet. They were like the little apartment at the Museum of the City of New York, which, you know, the size of the table, and they were great. But it was interesting. They were both people in the arts and theater. They were both people in their 60s, I think, who had come to New York several decades ago, and really the only way they were able to live in New York and make careers in New York is by having these tiny little spaces, one of which was a 5-flight walk-up. So that was kind of an ever-present theme that's, you know, only getting more intense. Yes.
You didn't mention, how did you find these people?
Oh, that's a very good question. Everyone would ask me that. Well, I asked everybody I knew. And I sort of do that with all stories, and I have a horrible feeling that by the time I'm not at the Times, I will have no friends left because I will, you know, driven them all away, and maybe that's happening. But I would ask everyone I knew of sort of all walks of life. You know, do you know anyone who might want me to write about them? And the one thing I would say is it doesn't have to be decory. It doesn't have to be like, oh, you know, they have great chairs and, you know, great chandeliers or something. It just has to be people who have an interesting story and are willing to talk to me and have their names in the Times and, excuse me, are living legally where they are and are willing to tell me roughly how much they pay to live where they do. And a few people said no, but I think a lot of people were kind of flattered, and people would afterwards, this is so interesting, would tell me that they felt that the story kind of gave dignity to where they lived, One thing I was very, very moved by, a lovely couple who were friends of a friend who lived in one of these great classic sixes, the Upper West Side. He was a professor of Chaucer at Brooklyn College, and she was an actress, and they had 8 zillion books, and they traveled, and she was Greek, and it was a great, great story. All these theatrical posters around. And after the story appeared, the woman, Delphi, said to me that her relatives from New Jersey always used to make fun of her and her husband because they just had kind of a lot of books. They didn't have like some beautiful split level in the suburbs. And she said, and I was totally enchanted with where they lived and the books and everything. But she said it kind of made them feel much better, and it gave dignity to their surroundings. It was sort of the answer to people who said, why don't you live in a split level in the suburbs? And I was amazed because I thought people would kill for their apartment and their way of life and the books and the decor. But obviously people had been giving them a hard time. And a lot of people, I think it was almost like, it's the writer's job, but you could articulate what it was about where they lived that meant something to them, even if they couldn't quite do it themselves. But you could do it because that's your job.
I have a friend, Sturgis Warner.
I beg your pardon?
Sturgis.
Oh, yeah, Sturgis, yeah. One of the tiny little apartments, yeah.
In the colony. And
Yeah, opposite the public theater, yeah.
How did you find him?
I found Sturgis through someone I know at the Times who was interested in theater and who I knew a little bit. And I said to him, as I said to her, if you know anyone who might make for good story, tell me. And he said, well, I know someone, and I've done some rehearsals in his apartment, and it's interesting because it's tiny, and he's fighting with the Blue Man Group, who were his owners of his building, who lived in the bottom. It's still going on, right, just these many years. And so it's sort of an interesting, like, what rights does a tenant have? And he was great because he was an example of someone who had this little space, but it was because it was little and cheap, and the 5-flight walk-up, that enabled him to stay in New York and have a career in the theater and the kind of thing that everyone did far more easily 30 and 40 years ago. But he was, someone at the office, and Boris was someone who worked for me, and he said, I know someone has this hacienda in the sky. And I have a daughter who's in her 20s, and she recommended the kids in Bushwick because one of them was the son of her voice teacher in Providence, and then she recommended a couple who lived in Long Island City, and they were, the brother of a friend of hers, and they were great, but then they split up. You think these people are going to go on forever. And it was really, and a few of them came over the transom, not so many. And not always, some were good. They weren't always the best. But the other 300 square foot theatrical person who I think had read the Sturgis Warner column, and he said, I have an even smaller apartment in Hell's Kitchen, and it looked much bigger because it had mirrors. He was someone who was in Cats, so he was very interesting. And they were the 2 smallest apartments that I wrote about, and the 2 of them, like with Boris, came and talked with me at the Museum of the City of New York a few months ago, where they had this exhibition on micro-housing, but they were like real-life examples of micro-housing before it had the name.
Well, his isn't that small, and he has a sleeping wall.
Yeah, he built it, has high ceilings.
7 feet tall.
Yeah, exactly, yeah, it makes it harder.
So he built this whole apartment.
Yeah.
With his time.
Yeah. But still, looks bigger than it is.
Yesterday, it's funny, just walking.
Yeah, well, it's a great place. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
What question would you? What do your parents think about your place now, especially that it's not something that's reflected in their own culture and upbringing? And I have a question coming for you about how this writing of these stories has changed your perception of your own living space.
That's an interesting question. Sometimes I think about how I would write about my apartment. and or
Let somebody do it.
yeah, right. I probably
not you,
kill
right? It's
myself.
somebody
Yeah,
else, right?
yeah. Well, it's sort of. I sort of think, well, what would I say this means, or how did it come to be? So it's sort of like, one step from reality. And would it be a nice story? Would it say nice things? But I think probably one reason I was drawn to doing this column, or felt very grateful when I got it, is I'm a great believer in that it matters where you live. And one of the things about the Grand Concourse book, if there's like one takeaway message which someone told me and I kind of internalized, is that that where you live matters. And if it's sort of ugly and awful, that has an effect on you. And if it's better, that has an effect on you. And that it's not random. It's not a random equation. And you can make, all the literature read about the importance of place. I was rereading Tony Hiss's book on I forgot the name, The Meaning of Place, or The Importance of Place, and he quotes study after study that talks about the importance of light and air and parks and grass and trees and vistas and sky and so on and so on. And I'm a real believer in that. So I think about it, and I'm very lucky. I live in a small but lovely apartment in Brooklyn Heights with this amazing, sadly 9/11 view, but still a beautiful view. And it's now one of the brownstones, but it's still the benefit of the neighborhood. But I think anyone who's interested in urban things, this is the takeaway.
And I would just add that how you bring a place to life on the page makes a lot of difference. It's partly the place and partly the life you give it with a written word. Because prior to Connie's profile, my apartment was profiled mid-design by Apartment Therapy. Do you guys know that blog? Yeah. Right. Well, if anyone's curious, look it up. But, it was kind of a disaster because I tried to explain some of the same things that I explained to Connie. And that person, let's just say, heard them in a very different way. And it was a bit of a disaster, as the 1,000 comments testified. It was sort of a nightmare. So Connie's a very gracious writer, and I really like the way that I really like the person that I ended up on.
Well,
I wanted to be that person.
Well, the last thing I should say, one of the things I tried to do in the column, and I think it's just me, and it could have been something else. There are people who have done it differently, but what I tried to articulate is sort of how the person felt about where they lived, and kind of not how I felt or how I thought, but sort of their. What they would say if they were me, and why the place was meaningful to them. Sort of try to tease that out, and not. I didn't even want to, but not making fun of it or kind of rolling my eyes. Which is an approach one could have, and people have had it. But it was sort of like explaining people to themselves. Obviously, some people were more articulate about it. Boris's great phrase about father hands of gold. That worth the price of admission. Not everybody was that articulate, and that it was easier when people were. But it was almost trying to reflect back to them what they thought, and be validate exactly, and sort of be the mirror. And that was, psychologically felt comfortable. I'm not a gotcha journalist, which is why I don't do housing economics, I guess. But that's kind of what I'm trying to do anyway. So this was a perfect place.
But not all stories have happy endings. To answer your question, at best, my parents have a begrudging affection for the place. They refuse to stay over because they find themselves unable to fall asleep because of the noise, even though I give them the bedroom and I take the very uncomfortable couch. They won't stay over. They are not at ease with the neighborhood, let's say diplomatically. Meanwhile, speaking to something you just said, they have an absolutely gorgeous home in New Jersey that looks like no other home in suburban New Jersey. It's basically a huge loft. It's a New York City loft that happens to be a home in New Jersey. It has no basement. It has no playrooms for kids, and it's been on the market for ages and they can't sell it. It's one of the most beautiful homes you'll ever see, but as far as a suburban New Jersey resident is concerned, it's unusable, which is a personal affront for my mother.
Were you the only child?
Can you guess? What do you think?
I think at that note we're supposed to be ending it. And thank you.
Pour a
Thank you.
glass of wine and-
Okay.
and,
Okay, great.
We can continue to ask questions over here near the books and thank Connie and Boris for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was a good audience.
Yes.
Yeah.
Lovely, absolutely.
I'm Carol Wilson. I'm the founder and director of the museum, and I welcome you here and remind you that we have an author's talk once a month, every month of the year, and the card for the next series, this is the last one of our fall-winter series, but starting, actually not as it says right here, on January 28th, because our very illustrious speaker, Vishwan Chakrabarti, has to go to London on the 28th, and so we just changed it to February 4th, where you'll see all of that on our website. But we like, when it's possible, to have a kind of theme to the series of the talks, and we like to gear them as much as possible to our exhibition. And I'll make that connection to Connie's book in a moment, but just so you know that you can find on our website and come any one of the evenings where we try to open up the space so that you can see the exhibition and have a nice intellectual evening of thinking about New York and its history, or the history of the skyscrapers, and then we'll invite you to have a drink at a reception afterwards where you'll also be able to talk to Connie and Boris more directly, and I hope buy a book and get it signed by the author. This particular exhibition that we have up now will be up through April, probably through the end of April, is called Sky High and the Logic of Luxury, and it looks at this new crop of kind of beanpole buildings, the very super slender, ultra luxury towers that are going up, I'd say around town, but most of them are around Central Park and 57th Street. They've been in the news a lot. They've been on the front page of the New York Times a few times. And they represent the ultra high end of a new form of skyscraper living in New York, and I think really a new type of tower in skyscraper history. So I hope that you'll have time to look around the exhibition. What we did in the show is really to focus more on the development strategy and the ideas that explain these buildings, and very little on the marketing strategy of amenities, the story that the developers tell about their buildings, and the consultants that try to increase the allure and desire of these really ultra high-end apartment buildings, which are all condominium towers. And that certainly represents one end of the spectrum that most of us will never experience, because these penthouse apartments have been reported to be in contract for at least 3 of them now for $90 million or more. And I think probably about the least expensive is about 12 or for the smallest apartments, or maybe 20 or 30 or $50 million. So this is really an extreme end of what is not really a new phenomenon in New York, either for slenderness, because New York is a place where, I think when you see the history of slenderness over there, the improbably slender tower is actually a characteristic form in the city. It's just that it's been office buildings before, and it's been that the desire to locate a kind of vertical density on a small piece of land has been a function either of no government regulation, or some particular kind of zoning, but in conjunction with the high value of land, which is always the story in Manhattan, capitalizing on the value of land. So that's what this form of slenderness and that form of slenderness that you see along there has created in this kind of characteristic, eccentric building that we see across the whole history of the skyscraper in New York. Now, Connie Rosenblum has, for much of the last couple of decades of her career, been focusing on the story of real estate and the history of New York, as I think probably everybody here knows, she has long been a writer and editor at the New York Times. In the arts and leisure section, in the real estate section, and in particularly in editing the what used to be called the city section rather than the metropolitan section in its broader purview now, I suppose. But she's always been fascinated with New York history, New York people, and telling stories. So this is actually the second time that she has graced us with one of her books. The first time she spoke is a little more than a year ago, when she talked about her history of the Grand Concourse in a book that you'll also see around the corner, Boulevard of Dreams. And this book, Habitats, Private Lives in a Big City, brings together a whole series of her profiles in the real estate section of the Times. And I think the person who must be her favorite profile is Boris Fishman.
He really is, number one, in my heart.
Well, you're first.
For your social calendar than any of the other profiles.
No.
And Connie suggested when I invited her to speak, which seems so appropriate within this context of looking for now the Skyscraper Museum looks for the first time at residential high-rise living, because we've always looked at office buildings or mixed-use buildings before. So it made a lot of sense to focus, as she does in this book, on the spectrum, kind of mosaic of how New Yorkers live as you kind of peek in the windows or you get invited in the front door. So it's really a delight, I think, to be able to have both Connie with her overview, which you're going to, I think, introduce the overview of the book, and then have a conversation with Boris after that. So Boris Fishman is a writer himself, and he is in June, is it, coming out with his first work of literature, as it's described, I think, on one of the websites, which is, he's the author of A Replacement Life, and I hope you'll tell us a little bit about that as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.